thank you so much for taking this time to chat with KidsXpress Conversations. I don't think there's ever been as important time to actually connect with people like yourself who know so much about our children, so much about our schools, and has a really deep appreciation for children's mental health and how we need to support our children through these crazy times. So really grateful for this time. Adrian, I'm going to ask a number of questions. I hope none of them are too curly. Just divert off if they are. During this time, I've spoken to so many parents, particularly recently, who are just desperate to go back to being their child's mum or dad and just don't want to be their child's teacher anymore. You know, obviously, children being at home and homeschooling has been really challenging. And in reading your book, 12 Ways Your Child Can Get the Best Out of School, one of the things you cover really well, and I think with such depth and insight, is the importance of a really strong parent-school, parent-teacher partnership, and how they really need to work together to get the best outcomes, to perform their roles, but also get the best outcomes for their kids. So during all this time, I'm really fascinated by this, how all of a sudden parents are just bowing to teachers. They're the superheroes. Do you think the parents will have a renewed appreciation for our teachers? But I'm also really curious, why have they only just realised how tough a teacher's job is and why they are superheroes?
Well, I guess we've never, as parents, and I'm a parent of a 9-year-old and a 12-year-old, we've never actually had to do the teaching. I think we would find, if we were thrust into any other job, we'd probably find it's equally difficult. If we'd had to make our own coffee at a cafe every morning when we turned up to grab it, we'd find out that actually making coffees is not as easy as it looks either, or whatever it might be. So I actually think it's, in that sense, it's been almost, well, let's say that's a healthy outcome from the whole lockdown and closed schools, a greater appreciation of what teachers do. But I would think too that for a lot of parents, they understand their children a lot better, and they understand the way their children learn a lot better. I think sometimes things that you might have heard a teacher tell you about your children, or you've heard in a parent-teacher interview, you might have said, "Oh yeah, I know that." But now I think parents really know what they mean when, you know, it's difficult to get little Johnny to sit still or to concentrate, or their handwriting's not, you know, there's a few quirks in their handwriting. Yeah. I think parents have got to see a fair bit of that. So how best do you support your children as a parent is not as a teacher, because that's why we pay people who've got 4 years of university training to teach our children. But our job as parents is as a guide, not as a teacher. So guide them in having self-discipline, guide them in having respect for teachers, for schools, for the learning, the value of education. Those are the kinds of things that is the role of parents, not to teach them how to do long multiplication, to teach them about the value of it, and even to teach them about the relevance of it. I mean, if a child asks you, why do I need to care about my times tables? Teaching them about why that matters. When you go to a store and you order, or you go to the cinema and you order 3 tickets and they're $12.50 each, why being able to multiply, do your times table might help you from getting ripped off if somebody tries to charge you $75 for it. So those are the kinds of things that we are expected as parents to do, and we should do. How to behave properly, how to have respectful relationships. All of those things we teach, and hopefully we teach by our own behaviour. But for the first time, parents have been asked to actually do the teaching, and it's been quite a challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. And so beautifully, I love that. You're absolutely right. I get my coffee every morning, but I couldn't make coffee to save. I mean, I would struggle with instant these days. So I love how you frame that in terms of the appreciation for anybody's role is something we only really know when we step into the other person's shoes, essentially. Given COVID-19, and I don't think any of us can really escape at the moment of talking about COVID-19, it really has also highlighted the important role that schools and the teachers play in the children's social emotional well-being. And as we emerge out of this COVID-19 bubble, and as we are all going back to school, etc., what learnings would you like us to take forward from this? And what do you think schools will need to do to help them cope and manage potentially the increased social emotional challenges that many of our children may experience now, but also as the sort of weeks and months go on and there's still so much uncertainty? What do you think we're going to need to do?
I think, and I would hope that schools are doing this, and they are generally. And it's different for really young children as opposed to children, in their teens, because forgetting even just about the school closures, but it's been a very traumatic few months for everybody. I mean, you couldn't turn on the television without hearing about it, and you still can't. So it's been ever present for children. So inside and outside kind of the school context. So just explaining that even the sort of historical context of something like this, just to allay some of those anxieties and fears about it. Because when you're 7, this may well be the biggest international global event that's ever occurred. But if you're 87, you've experienced quite a few. And, these things are terrible and lots of suffering, but they do come and go. They're a reality of life, unfortunately. So to be able to for children to be able to understand it, these things are unfortunate, but they come and go. And look at the positives about how we've responded. And, I think speaking about some of the upside of what's happened helps to allay some of that anxiety. Now, I'm in no way a professional here, but, in terms of the impact on schools, I certainly think for year 12 students, it has a real impact because they've got exams at the end of the year. And if you miss a month or a couple of months, it has a big impact. I'm not so sure I would like to think that for example, if you miss a couple of months of primary school, over the space of 13 years of your schooling, I would hope that for most children, that's not going to be, a game changer. I hope not. And again, for some children, it's probably going to have a bigger impact because of where their starting point is. So children who are already struggling, disengaged, don't have supportive sort of arrangements at home. Some children don't have safe even home environments.
Yeah.
So that couple of months have been pretty tough for them. Other children have had other experiences. Yeah. I think it would be interesting. Lots of academics are going to be working on having a look at what impact this has had. And as I said, I'd like to think that a couple of months for your average kid in primary school or year 7 and 8, it's not going to be the end of the world. But I do feel particularly for year 11 and 12 students who've got exams at the end of the year and may have had a real variety of experiences during that couple of months.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we underestimate, we still think they're children, and from an age perspective they are, but the stress that they hold at that particular time of their learning of those formative years, I think adding that extra stress, knowing they've missed out. But I also do agree. I think the missing out on essentially a couple of months of how schooling normally is in that 13 years of schooling, you would hope that in actual fact there will be other learnings in this, that for children during this time that will support them maybe in a different way as we move forward. Yeah. That your comment about the other things that have also happened, if you just look at this year, yes, we've got COVID-19, but we also had the summer bushfires, we've had floods, we've had droughts, there's so much going on. And you're obviously absolutely right in terms of these things do happen. They are part of our life. For our children, they are experiencing these adverse childhood experiences that their grandparents have lived through. And so there's the sharing of life, I think, that I've certainly witnessed between families around how we can get through this. One of the things I'm also interested is that we know that nobody is immune to the emotional and mental strain that these things can cause. And that KidsXpress, we've been providing expressive therapy both within our centre-based program, but also in many schools across Sydney for a long time now. And in the last 2 years, we have also started doing trauma-informed training and education specifically for teachers and the school community. And it really has resonated both from a culture, leadership, but right through to every child in school. And so it's something we're really passionate about and believe that teachers and school staff really benefit from understanding of what trauma and the behaviours of trauma actually looks like. So I'm curious how you think this is, and also are there any other changes that you think we need to make in the education system that can support children, but really importantly also support the emotional mental health of our teachers?
Yeah, I think there's a growing need to teach in a different way to children who have directly experienced trauma. So, I mean, again, I'm no expert here, but there is trauma that the children are impacted by directly. For example, if you're in one of those communities directly affected by the bushfires. And then there are children who see that on the news every day of the week for whatever it was, a few months, affected by that kind of the trauma from a distance. And I think that's similar to the COVID experience in Australia, just 24/7 bombardment. And that does affect children and their views of the world and the views of their world that the world is a dangerous place. But it's also, so I'll come back to the specific teaching, but this is also a teaching moment for children too. And we always talk about resilience, children, and to minimise COVID or bushfires or whatever it might be, to say, no, everything will be fine, it's no problem, you don't need to worry about it because you're only 10, is maybe not the best way of handling it, as opposed to suggesting that, these things do happen, they have negative consequences, people suffer, we do get over it, we've got great people in the health system, etc., that deal with it, because that is true. And September 11, post-September 11, there was this global trauma about, wow, the entire world's changed forever, and those graphic pictures. These unfortunate things do happen. So it is a teaching moment as well for parents. How do parents respond to this information? Their children are watching how parents respond. And then the second thing is, this growing awareness that you've got to teach in a different way, and you've got to have different training when you're teaching children with trauma, because children who have experienced personal trauma need different teaching approaches. They need different ways of dealing with their trauma, and whether it's through other things, art and the various other things that children use to help them cope. There's a greater growing awareness of it. Now, we're a long way from having enough teachers taught in teaching trauma, but we're kind of getting there. So I think that's a really positive thing. And I have no doubt that, this COVID thing's been so sort of profound. I don't think that any school wouldn't be dealing with it from a student wellbeing and a staff wellbeing perspective, and most employers are dealing with it from a staff wellbeing perspective. But I would suggest it'll be, at least for a little while, built into some of the teacher training courses that are being run as well, for undergraduate school teachers, but even the ongoing professional development that teachers do around how you manage the stress and the anxiety of children, but how do you manage your own anxiety about it as well. I think it's just sort of invaded every part of life. Definitely schools, definitely the workplace, definitely children, and the way that we interact with children, that we teach them about kind of moments in history like this and how we deal with it. And you can focus on the positives. The way governments have led us from both sides of the political spectrum in Australia, been a positive, because so much negative about government, negative about bureaucracy. But look, the bureaucracy's really stepped up here. How lucky we are to live in Australia with the health system we've got. There's lots of actual real positives to take out of this. The way people have worked together, you see some of those beautiful images of applauding, health workers at 7 p.m, around the world. It's actually a lot of real positives that I think adults appreciate, but children really appreciate as well.
I've been actually quite interested in terms of some of the things we've seen around the world. It's actually a lot of the children that have led that praise for emergency workers, and they really feel it. I know I went to a friend's place for dinner on Saturday night, and their little 4-year-old was obviously very concerned I was coming into their home because they hadn't had anybody at home, and she had some very, a list of questions she wanted to ask me to make sure it was okay that I was there. And once we had answered those questions, she was fine. But that initial anxiety of me being at the door was a really palpable thing for her. And if we just, as you say, if we just dismiss that, we actually increase that child's anxiety rather than just really simply addressing it the way it is.
I think it's important to ask children what they think about it.
Yeah.
Because they may not necessarily talk about it with adults, but it's just been everywhere for months, so they certainly know about it.
Yeah.
I think it's important to say, have you got any questions? That you want answered.
I think you also, that piece around, really encouraging to hear that you also agree with that teachers do need to know more about trauma informed and how they can support kids with trauma. Really interestingly for us, we've also in our, training and support to teachers is actually identifying what is trauma, what is a traumatic, well, what's a behaviour that's related to trauma, and then also filling up what does a teacher need to do to fill their cup up, because obviously they can't support and they can't see things like that if they're depleted. So I'm curious what you would say to a teacher to help them manage their own mental health, given everything that's going on in the world and what they're having to deal with every day.
Yeah, look, that's a really good question. And I mean, what I've loved about my time when I was education minister and since being involved with the University of New South Wales, deeply involved with the teaching profession, is that, and I always say this, that teachers don't do teaching for the money. They do it for genuine love of children and the work they do and imparting knowledge and the satisfaction that they get out of that. But that sometimes comes at a bit of a personal cost, because teachers often put the interests of their children ahead of their own personal interests. So, whether that's going to a meeting every night and, the number of principals I see going to their own, and then every other neighbouring schools, award ceremonies when they've got their own families at home. They're by the nature of people who do teaching, they're very giving. So my advice always is, you need to protect yourself first. You need to look after yourself. If you're feeling, anxious or whatever it might be, make sure you get the assistance you need. And if you need to take time off, because if you're not in the right headspace yourself, you're actually not much good to anybody else. So protect your own well-being first, because you can't look after other people's well-being if your own well-being is suffering at the same time. So that's kind of the license to look after yourself. And sometimes teachers don't feel that they have that, because there are so many things going on with all their students and other staff, whatever. You actually have to give. Sometimes you have to give teachers permission to actually look after themselves. And I would say that because I say it about myself. I say it about myself as well. I always, I don't hesitate to take time for myself to say, I feel like I need to do, because if I'm feeling crap, then my wife is unhappy, my children are unhappy, my work is unhappy, I'm unhappy. And it just doesn't serve anybody's purposes. But teachers particularly need to be given sometimes, and I say that in the nicest possible way, that permission to actually look after themselves first.
Yeah. Oh, Adrian, I have to say, I think that's such a beautiful way to answer, because it is so critically important. And there are so many, and I agree, I think the teaching community, and maybe we even go to the frontline emergency, they will often put other people ahead of themselves, and it does take a leader like yourself sometimes to actually give them that permission, but also to say how important it is for you. So everything that I have gleaned about you, Adrian, is that leadership is so important, and I think even more important now for people to hear that you put your emotional mental health first, and so everybody should do that. And I think it's incredibly important, and working out what that is and how people take care of themselves is just is vital at these times. You mentioned your 9-year-old son.
Yeah, and 12
and
year old.
and 12-year-old son, and you know, the complexity of being, you know, a professional and a parent, etc. So you've been at home, you've been homeschooling. So as a father, what were the highlights, or even maybe some of the lowlights for you during this homeschooling COVID-19 time?
Well, you know, as I said, I've learned a lot about my children, and I've learned a lot about their schooling, um, and what they're capable of doing, strengths and weaknesses. I mean, I've just learned that by sitting next to them and doing their work. I guess the upside of it has actually been outside of their schoolwork. You know, the actually being confined to your house or your local community, not traveling anywhere, not going away for the weekend. So we're just home, not going out for dinner. We're just home all the time. And you know what? I actually think my children have absolutely loved it. Absolutely loved it. I mean, the only thing children want for Christmas is their parents' time, right? And you know what? COVID, for all the negatives it's generated, that's actually one of the benefits it's generated for a lot of families. Not all, every family. It's just the time together. You know, it's we've done lots of mountain bike riding because that's one of the few things you could do, particularly in the kind of harshest period of the lockdown. Done a lot of mountain bike riding. The kids have gone mountain bike riding on their own, so they've really kind of extended themselves. And you know, so in terms of our family relationships, that's been a really fantastic thing. I mean, I'd hope they've kind of kept up with their schoolwork, but it's that family relationship that, unfortunately, the cycle of kind of our rapid living kind of Western life, you know, it's constantly going out, doing something, kids are doing sport or whatever they're doing. You know, kids just want your time as a parent. And so often we don't have the time to give it. And we've been forced to do that, which has been, I think, a really great thing.
I can't agree more. I've also had a lot of conversations, interestingly, particularly with dads, saying, I've really, like, almost apologising. I've really enjoyed this time. I've got to know my children. I've been goofy with my kids. I've mounted, you know, I've done things that I always say we'll get to, but we never really get to. And I think that's one of the really beautiful things out of this, is people have been forced to really spend time and know more about each other. And, you know, just having, albeit forced, and I guess as we move through this, is also hold on to some of that. Don't let go of all of that, because we get busy again and we get demand, you know, pulled left, right and centre. And I think that will also be something that is something that people are going to say, no, I don't want to do all those things anymore. I want to spend time with my family because it's really important. It's important now.
I think knowing how much, well, not every person who works can do things by video conference or by telephone, of course, but for that amount of work that you can do by video conferencing, it's actually the time it saves you from travelling from Parramatta to the CBD of Sydney, or from the regions from mine. And for me to go and do a 2-hour meeting in Sydney means I leave home at 6 o'clock in the morning, get on a plane. It's an entire day away from my family to go to a 2-hour meeting, whereas you can do it. Now everybody's realised that actually you can do it by video conference. Yeah. And it's actually not the 2 hours that is the problem. It's the travelling time and all the other, that is the time the valuable time you usually have spent away from family. So I don't think people are going to give that up, you know.
No, I agree. Yeah, I totally agree. Adrian, you are highly respected across many, many arenas. You're clearly very passionate about education and children. You led the political campaign to reform school funding in Australia and introduced great teaching, inspired learning. And the reforms in New South Wales, and obviously your book is widely acclaimed. So I'm curious about you, and just listening to you, I could spend a long time, but my marketing team's told me I'm not allowed to talk for too long. I'm curious about what drives you to make such a point of difference, like to make such a difference, and what was the critical points in your life that led you to a path of education and children? Is this part of your legacy? Is this what you've always aspired to do?
Yes, look, it has been, because and you know, I always sort of recognise this power of education. It's one of those things that, as a person, if you get money, people can take it away. But the one thing you can't take away from somebody is their education. And you know, it's the great kind of leveler in society. It's the great leveler in society, and it's the role of government, which is essentially the role of the society, to actually deliver a world-class education to every student, irrespective of where they were born or who their parents were or where they live, as the great way of leveling society. Because, you know, we have these arguments in Australia about welfare and should people get government assistance here. And look, you can say that about adults. So you can say that about whether adults have made the wrong choices and that's why they're unemployed, or that's why they're drug dependent, or, you know, that adults have made wrong choices. But for a child, when the child is born into whatever circumstances, it's never the child's fault. So right from day one, from early childhood through to school, you know, if a child is born into a circumstance that is, you know, in the varying circumstances that children are born, as a society, we have the responsibility to at least level the playing field at school. Because once you've got an education, once you've got a good quality education, then, you know, every door is open for you. Then you choose, then you make the choices as adults. Unfortunately for a lot of kids, they're born into tricky circumstances, they don't get a great education, and then they have limited opportunities, and then, you know, they're limited choices. So I've always sort of been motivated by the power of education as a real life-changing thing for everybody. I mean, that's whether you're born into a you know, your parents are rocket scientists or whoever they are. You know, it has the opportunity to change people's lives, but particularly for those children who are not born, you know, into the greatest of circumstances. And I just have always been attracted to the power that generates. And then what you do as a, you know, public official, in my case as a minister, and now as a working for a university, to make sure that system is as effective as possible. And I've always been sort of, you know, focused by that. I mean, I was born into great circumstances, you know, family that had money, every opportunity. I was sent to university, you know, great. But I feel like I have a responsibility to do something with that, which is hopefully what I've done over the last 10 or 15 years.
Oh, Adrian, absolutely. I think the difference that you've made, and knowing that's where it comes from, that want for any child to have the best possible life they can, education is so important. And certainly where KidsXpress comes from is actually supporting children so that they are able to learn even through their trauma, that they are able to regulate, that their brains are able to function as healthy as possible so they can learn, is incredibly important for all of us and for our future. And so, you know, I remain incredibly inspired that this is your legacy, and we can obviously see that's going to continue.
Well, look, and that's the best example, right?
Yeah.
You know, the trauma a child experiences is never their fault. Yeah. So whatever you think of the parents who presumably are part of causing that trauma, yes, they might have made bad decisions, etc. And you might think, you know, people might make judgments about that, but you can never make that judgment about a child, right? They're always the victims of trauma, never the causes of it. And, you know, as a society, we can't do enough to support those children to overcome what ultimately wasn't their choice, wasn't their decision. Yeah. So, you know, I think the work that KidsXpress does and other organisations like that, including schools, is phenomenal. And then you hear those great stories about kids who've gone through all trauma and gone through all these things, and they've had that great opportunity, whether it's, you know, an experience with KidsXpress or a great teacher, and then they've gone on to, you know, make fantastic life choices and have great experiences.
It's just, I think we need more people like yourself, just putting us on the right path and giving us all, and children importantly, the opportunity. And I'm going to close with probably the most curly question and the biggest question. And I've left it to last because I think, given everything that's going on, but particularly the images that we're currently, you mentioned before about children being overloaded with images, but the images that are bombarding all of us at the moment from around the world. How does our world become a better place for our children?
I think the biggest risk in places like Australia, the United States, here's my cat, places like the United States and Australia, I mean, this equity issue that we have where, when we're seeing, extreme wealth and extreme poverty, I mean, they are massive fault lines in Western democracies particularly, and they pose a big risk. They pose a big economic and social risk. And, it's no good being a billionaire if you have to be locked up behind a gate. So it's in the actual interests of everybody that we are a much fairer society. It's in everybody's interests. And I mean, look, I'm biased here, but I don't think people would disagree. But education is actually the best way to actually level that playing field to a degree. We're always going to have people who are wealthier than others or in better circumstances, but it's reached such an extreme now, and we're seeing it in places like the United States and parts of Europe and in Australia. And I think if we don't address it, then we're going to have increasing social problems in Australia. Even looking at the people who've died as a result of COVID, right? It has affected, particularly in the US, low-income people more than high-income people. That's just a reflection on existing inequities. It's not creating new ones. COVID's not created new inequities. As someone said, it's poured petrol on existing inequities, and it's highlighted what happens when you have these growing inequities, and then you throw in something like COVID, or you throw in a racial incident like we've seen in the United States. It's very dangerous, and that's a part of education is a big part of actually fixing that up. As I say, to make sure that if you're not from wealthy parents, that you can still get a good go in Australia. I think that's really important.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Adrian, it's been such a joy to speak to you, but it's a joy, but it's also incredibly inspiring. I think the work that we do, KidsXpress does at that grassroots level, but knowing that there's yourself and I'm sure you have akin people to your thinking around you, means that we have the thought leadership and I guess the vulnerability almost encouraged to go there and talk about these things and know that we need to create that equal playing field for our children so that we can have a better future for our children. So thank you so much for spending the time with me and KidsXpress Conversation, albeit via Zoom. Hopefully one day we'll actually be able to get to meet in person. So thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure, and thank you very much. And thank you very much for the fine compliment. I love the work that I do. Don't tell my employer, but I do it for nothing.